right. Well, thank you. And thank you, Kirti, for that introduction. So I have done a lot of work on patent policy. I'm really a lobbyist by avocation. But I haven't done as much in 5G. So I was interested to really do this panel, frankly, just so that I could learn more about it. And I think that makes me a good moderator, since I don't know much about it. We can all learn together. So I like to joke that many policymakers, Senator or Chairman Tillis notwithstanding, when we talk about 5G, there's all the hype in the press and 5G, 12 trillion to the US economy, these sorts of things. Most policymakers wouldn't know how to spell 5G if they were asked to do so. So I think maybe we'll start with a very basic question here. Durga, maybe for you first. What is a G and what is 5G as distinguished from the other Gs?
Okay, I can go on for 2 days on that one, but I'm going to compress it in 2 minutes, and let's see if I can do that. 5G is the fifth generation of wireless communication standards that is now coming into mainstream starting from 2019. By the way, it's been a long time coming, but 2019 is the year of 5G when the initial deployments will start coming up. But let me actually take a step back on that. A lot of us have been involved in the previous generations of technology as well, and it is important to understand that there's been a gradual shift in the way that we think about wireless communications. Back in the day when there was the 1G to 2G transition, it was primarily, this was in the early 90s, it was primarily all about voice, and cellular phones were simply used to make voice calls. And the idea was to keep increasing the capacity of the network. More people can make the voice calls. So it was an analog to digital transition. The voice quality improved and cell phones became mainstream. But there was something else that was going on in the early 90s. And if you remember, that was the advent of the wireline internet. People were using the internet quite a lot more, sitting in their desktops and simply working on PCs. So the idea was then to make that into a wireless technology. Why can't you actually surf the web using your cell phone instead? So that was the 2G to 3G transition. So this was the case where we started bringing in mobile data communications. But things didn't really take off till we reached 4G. We reached a point in time, this was back in 2004, I remember that distinctly, when we were talking of going towards hundreds of megabits of data rates on your devices, being able to seamlessly surf the web and do lots of database communications, bringing IP networks for the first time into the mainstream. And that unleashed the wave of smartphones. And throughout these generations of technologies, we've always focused on our devices, just the cell phones. But when it comes to 5G, it's different. We've had a far more expansive view, a far more expansive vision of what we want to do. Thinking of this as a unifying connectivity fabric, something that communicates not just between humans and between cell phones, but the applications range from cell phones to laptops to manufacturing equipment to autonomous vehicles. Mobile devices that truly embrace augmented and virtual reality glasses, bringing into account lots of new kinds of use cases. So it's far more expansive. And one of the things that we have gone through as a part of this transition is a lot of new industries, vertical industries, which have never used cellular technology before, they are embracing this for the first time ever. And so it's a very exciting time actually to be working in this space. Yes, 2019 is still going to be, when we talk of 5G, it's going to be about smartphones and laptops and mobile hotspots and so on. But we are laying the foundation for what's going to come next in the upcoming years.
So what sort of industries? You said other industries are embracing this.
The examples that I can think of immediately are industrial IoT applications. The manufacturing sector has gone through a lot of transition in terms of going from a very wireline centric based manufacturing towards wireless manufacturing, but really using wireless to make sure that you can control a lot of high precision equipment, lots of data collection that occurs in the process as well, far more flexible environment. Bringing in ultra-reliable communications, and it really transforms the way that a typical manufacturing plant looks like. I've spent a lot of time in the last 5 years with a lot of our customers in this space. And it's about bringing enterprise IT mentality into a manufacturing sector, really transformative. The other one that one can think of, it's becoming very interesting these days, is more and more vehicles have cellular connectivity inbuilt in them. There's a statistic that we've been following. More than 25% of the vehicles today come in with an inbuilt connectivity in them. they are connected to the network. And so if vehicles are connected to the network, then it's only one step further from there to say, well, vehicles can now not just communicate with the network around them, but start communicating with other vehicles around them, bringing into account safety. Vehicles communicating with the roadside infrastructure, traffic lights, stop signs, and so on. It's a very different experience than in terms of what you can accomplish with that. It has bearings on autonomous driving. It has bearings on safety. Smart cities actually come into play as well. There's a lot of other applications that come in there. So these are two examples of industries that have historically not really used mobile communications before, but now they've completely embraced it. And this is what we are looking at over the next 5 years.
Okay, so thank you. So David, we've heard from Durga a couple examples of industries that are really embracing 5G, but more broadly, why should we care about 5G? Why is it so important? Why is there such a fierce competition to develop 5G?
And this is a point people don't understand. Of course, it's innovation, and we know innovation drives productivity and it drives competition. But this is a particular class of innovation that I call enabling technology. Economists, and it's actually, we have to thank the economic historians for this, they talk about general purpose technologies. These are innovations that impact not just one industry, not just one product, but many industries and the whole economy. And this is what Durga is telling us here, that there's all kinds of verticals, not just autonomous vehicles, not just healthcare, not just manufacturing, but there's new avenues for innovation that are opened up. So this is sort of the innovation that unlocks other innovation. And people don't get this. Policymakers don't get it. Courts don't get it. What economists would say, at least those that study innovation, and most don't, but those economists that study innovation talk about the social returns, which is the spillover effects. And it's clear that the spillover effects from enabling technology are many, many, many times the spillovers from discrete innovations. You know, a new iPhone, fantastic product, but nothing in terms of the economy-wide impact that an enabling technology has. And if we can't figure this out as a policy matter and just treat all innovation the same, then we're not going to get enough of the really good stuff. So to me, that distinction, the fact that this has impact on multiple verticals, you know, it's electricity was an enabling technology, you know, the printing press was enabling technology, lasers were enabling technologies. There are a class of these very special innovations that we really need to care about because they have economy-wide impact.
So 5G is an enabling technology in a way that previous Gs were not.
Well, yes, it's a matter of degree, obviously, but I think because we're marrying the Internet of Things along with 5G, you're really getting something that's, you know, orders of magnitude bigger and better than anything we've ever seen before.
I remember going to see recently a senior administration official to talk about 5G issues, and the official, who's a telecom expert, was somewhat dismissive, saying, oh, 5G, it's all the hype. I mean, what's the big deal if I have a shirt that'll tell somebody sitting across from me whether or not I'm lying? What are the, it's a true story. What are the response to the skeptics of this, the people who think, boy, this is just all real hype, there's really no there yet?
Well, and this is another key point. I'm glad you asked that question. A lot of the benefit is still to come because, as I said before, 5G unlocks other innovation. And so the fact that people can't see it, look, most people can't see the future. I can't see the future. But what I can see is thousands of other innovators turned on through this technology. And that's why these people give you these dumb answers, you know, it's all hype. Well, maybe it looks like hype because they haven't figured out that we're in a highly innovative country, and when you give this tool to American entrepreneurs, they're going to do fantastic things with it. They can see the future. They will make the future. The policymakers just have to stand back and support it, and it will happen. There's no question about it. But to say it's hype, well, early on, everything looks like it's hype. But later on, when we see the flourishing of all the industries and all the products that are built on top, then they'll be singing a different tune, and they say, well, of course, we always knew that.
Is it possible to look in a crystal ball, and this is really for anybody, and think what are the commercial applications that we could see? You've talked a little bit about cars that talk to one another, but can you paint a picture for us, a vision of what the future of the U.S. economy or what it will look like?
Actually, I can start that one off, and then I'll pass it on to my eager colleague. One good way, because 5G is complicated if you're not in the tech industry, and it's sometimes difficult to define because 5G is more than just one thing. And one probably useful way to look at 5G and to try to understand it is not so much as a technology category, but as a roadmap for future technologies. And so what we see with all the Gs is that they come, or they're developed in phases. And currently, at the start of the 5G commercialization, what we're going to see mostly in the next year is enhanced broadband. So what that means to consumers is just basically faster download speeds, faster broadband internet speeds on their phones, which is why you're seeing Verizon, AT&T, Sprint, all the telecoms of the world getting into 5G and talking about faster speeds in 5G phones, right? But starting next year, that changes a little bit, and we're going to start talking about ultra-reliable, low-latency technologies or communications, and we're going to start talking about mass machine type communications. And so 5G the first year is going to be about smartphones and connectivity. 5G a year from now and going into the next decade will spread into other parts of many industries. The ultra-reliable, low-latency communications will touch on autonomous vehicles, or what will become fully autonomous vehicles at one point. They will essentially power mission-critical operations and technologies that require constant connectivity. Stuff like the industrial IoT, for instance, is going to be heavily dependent on this. And the mass machine communications is really about the rest of the IoT, the low power devices, all the sensors that make smart cities possible, that make smart infrastructure possible. So if you look at it in terms of that development, of it starting with cell phones and expanding and going from 1 to 2 gigabit per second speeds for your phones to 20 gigabits per second speeds for your phone, 10 years from now, or sometime in the next 10 years, it becomes a little bit clearer as to what the value of 5G is going to be overall.
If I were to just add a little bit further on that crystal ball, 2019 is the year of 5G, but as was correctly pointed out, in 2019 we're going to see predominantly the mobile broadband use cases that we are very familiar with. And there's usually a large number of skeptics who believe that, well, if it's basically the same use cases, then I don't quite get it exactly what we are doing. It's kind of important to understand that I think all of us in this room probably have devices which are capable of gigabit speeds. The truth is, very few of us ever get to see those gigabit speeds, more frequently than not. I mean, we don't actually see that. The average speed of a US consumer is somewhere between 30 to 50 megabits per second. It's slightly higher in Japan, it's higher in Korea, but we don't actually quite see that. One of the promises of 5G in 2019, hopefully we'll start seeing that as the networks come up, is that the average user rates actually go up quite a bit. Imagine if you're walking around in downtown and you actually get to see somewhere between 100 to 500 megabits per second speeds. It's not just the use cases that will start becoming different even on mobile devices, but the kinds of devices themselves are going to be different. We're going to see different kinds of devices. But 2019 is all about mobile broadband. Another important part as we head into 2020, there was the point on ultra-reliable low-latency communication. Just to give a sense of this, back in the day when we first, within our research team, when we were first looking at what should be the definition of ultra-reliable and low-latency, we just came out with a number like, well, let's just make sure that we can have a latency of a millisecond and a reliability of like 5.9 or a 6.9 reliability. With the general thinking that we don't always get to define the use cases when we are defining the technology, at least from our perspective in Qualcomm, we build the foundational technology and then we're going to build it and they will come. We have to trust upon the rest of the ecosystem actually to embrace that and then build upon that to come out with the new kinds of use cases. What we are talking of with high precision manufacturing and the ability to control machines remotely, it's just a starting point. That's not the end goal in itself. That's just a starting point. These are the two emerging use cases that we see already. One of the other points that actually 5G does bring to the table is if you have the capability of this ultra-reliable low-latency communication, what it really means is different pieces of equipment, whether it's devices or different machines and whatnot, they are wirelessly tethered. In a way, it appears as if they're all co-located. Another way of looking at that is we are distributing the processing across different nodes. And that distributed processing brings about a lot more capabilities into the picture. I'll give an example. Is this something? It is more in the. It's a little closer to mobile broadband, but distributing processing with augmented reality and virtual reality is something that's. It brings about a far more collaborative environment. But if you think of the head-mounted displays that are available today in the market, they're all pretty nice, except that they're really bulky, and you got to put something like this, and then you see a VR, some sort of a VR narrative. It's not quite the quality that you really want. Ideally, what you want is think of a virtual room in a telepresence wherein everyone is in their own locations, but at the same time they have the ability to communicate with each other in a very fast manner.
Like a holodeck in Star Trek.
Things of that sort, yes. I was not going to say that, but I'm glad you said it. It is something that, of course, we have to think along those lines. We'll never get there otherwise, but this is just the starting point of that. And that distributed processing is something that excites us quite a bit. We've been doing a lot of research in that space, so that's why I just wanted to mention that part as well. And over time, we will get into the role of wireless into autonomous vehicles as well. Today, autonomous vehicles are predominantly because of cameras and sensors, and that works very well. It does, however, limit the overall perception to visual line of sight. What you see is pretty much what you can act upon. But once it becomes purely wireless, complementing the cameras and sensors, you can go beyond line of sight, and that's a far more effective road world model that one can create and hopefully bring in additional elements of safety into the picture.
Okay, well, we've talked a lot about the commercial uses. Jeanette, I would like to ask you a little bit about the national security implications of 5G. Are there uses for the military or things we need to be concerned about?
Sure, and thanks for having me here. Usually security people don't get to talk at innovation conferences because everybody groans. And the way that we think about it, and I think you captured it really well early on, is for some reason 5G has kind of captured the imaginations of a lot of people in DC that maybe aren't sure what the 5 or the G means. And so I think part of on the national security conversation is we need to focus a lot more on education. And because sometimes we're mixing, just sort of general risk issues with any kind of, generation of communications infrastructure that is not unique to 5G. So that's sort of overall something that we're trying to focus on is, there's risk with all technology, but it's about having a transparent and open and I believe public conversation about the risk. So the way that I think about 5G on the national security side is there's sort of 3 components to risk. The first one is really the architecture itself. While it offers a lot of great opportunities and benefits and the enabling and the commercial applications that we're just talking about, which we want to continue to enable. The United States has led in amazing developments over the last 60, 70 years that has given birth to the internet and all these other amazing things. So we want to continue to be able to preserve that, but we want to make sure we're not doing it in a way that puts our public or our citizens or even global systems that rely on these technologies at risk. And so one of the kind of the challenges with the architecture itself is, historically, and currently, a communications provider can kind of segment between their core and their RAN, and they can make sort of, okay, I'm gonna have this type of equipment in my core, but on the RAN I'll have something else, and they can make sort of distinguishing decisions, and many have chosen not to have certain suppliers in that core network in the U.S. It's not the case in other countries, but in the U.S. that's been the decision. So in talking with a lot of the different telecommunications company, it's sort of thinking about, that eventually eliminating that distinction between the core and the RAN will provide them greater visibility down to those endpoint devices, which will be great because they can now see things that they can't currently see. It also offers the opportunity for an adversary who maybe has a friendly set of suppliers throughout that architecture. They could get that visibility as well. So that's sort of one thing that we're thinking about. And so how do you manage that risk? How do you, while you're innovating on the technology, how do you innovate on the security? Oftentimes people will just kind of innovate amazingly on the technology, and then they take sort of, here's a little security thing, let me throw it on there and see if I can manage that. But if we can kind of think about both at the same time, then we can take advantage of this new architecture, but also make it as safer and more secure than we currently have. The other two parts you touched on is sort of the industrial IoT, and these are, we're talking about cars and other sort of connected medical devices, those sorts of things, where you're really talking about a safety issue. Security and safety, I think, are increasingly two versions of the same thing. And I think it's helpful to talk about those in terms of safety, because we already have frameworks for dealing with safety, whether that's aviation safety, auto safety. They need to be modernized to think about what it means to now be connected and have access. But from my perspective, we're mostly concerned about an adversary that would now have access to be able to disrupt those types of capabilities. There's also a surveillance concern, of course, but higher priority is the safety. So how do we think about modernizing and as those or new applications come online? We're already talking with vehicle manufacturers and aviation companies and a variety of others around this space, medical device manufacturers, is just recognizing that they may not right now understand that total cost of some of that connectivity, but if you can start planning right now for some sort of security and safety measures in the development of it, then I think again we can get to both the innovation and the security. And then the last part is more in the consumer device space, where this is already a challenge, where you've just got consumers that are like, well, this is 50% cheaper, and it's like, well, but you're also giving all of your information to China. Maybe they're okay with that. But we need to find ways to have that total cost of what these devices are so they understand what the risk is, and we can ideally we can start to increase that consumer demand for more security, more privacy in their devices, and that's sort of a broader conversation between kind of the consumer side of things and manufacturers. So there's a lot with each parts of those, but that's sort of generally how we think about it. I think the overall more strategic that some folks have already talked about is, we've really gotten into a place where we have foreign companies that come from countries where we do not trust their legal regimes, and we are now very dependent on those companies. And those companies are offered subsidies and all sorts of other ways to play in markets that the U.S. And our what I call like-minded companies are not. And so I think the bigger picture is, what does this mean for how U.S. and other countries who embrace fully capitalism and rule of law and all of these things, how do we ensure that we have a playing field that is both beneficial for innovation as well as security? And that's a very important conversation, I think, to keep having, and what the role of government is to spur some of that, whether that's in the U.S. or ideally doing this jointly with other countries who have a similar perspective.
Well, thank you. You talked a lot about risks and concerns. Are there opportunities that the military thinks about for the use of this 5G technology?
Well, I'm no longer in the military, so I can't speak on their behalf. But absolutely, I can say even within our own space, one of the things that I was very much a part of the 3G to 4G transition. I was working on public safety uses for communications, and eventually now that's it's called FirstNet, it's Public Safety Broadband Network, and the idea that these technologies can also enable things like search and rescue. We've seen a lot of benefits, and we've really had to modernize our own thinking about national response frameworks and others, where you have victims that are lost in rubble that are using their cell phones, that they're actually working, and how do you then ensure that public safety use cases, military use cases, others, we tend to have a higher need for security and reliability, so how do you sort of get those use cases out into the market and have people building to those, and then ideally that would start to become maybe even available to consumers. But yeah, there's a tremendous amount of application as wireless technology enhances its ability, particularly in the reliability area, because those are some of the biggest challenges we have when migrating some of these security and safety missions to wireless.
Okay, thank you. So we've talked a lot about the uses of this technology, commercial, military. Who is actually developing 5G? What are the companies that we're talking about? There's infrastructure, there's equipment, technology. What does this marketplace look like? Olivier, maybe.
Okay, yeah, I guess that one's for me. Since not everybody can see my hand gestures, I want you to close your eyes and picture a pyramid. So essentially, yeah, the ecosystem for 5G is very much shaped like a pyramid. So at the very bottom, the base, the foundational layer, is the most important. That's where most of the work is done. All of the R&D, all of the math, the physics, the engineering, all the problem solving, the standard setting is done at the foundational layer. At that level, essentially you have a number of companies. You have Qualcomm, you have Huawei, Samsung, Nokia, Ericsson, all contribute to those standards. But above and beyond all of the rest in that community are two companies, and they're Qualcomm and Huawei, period. The other ones contribute, but not quite at the same level. They're distant thirds, fourths, and fifths. So it's very important to establish that the development of 5G in the foundational layer really lives there with these two companies. And you can look at it in terms of the US and China as well. So Qualcomm, US, China, Huawei, and those are your superpowers of 5G and eventually 6G development. Above that, you have a layer of silicon, which is basically the chip making. And above that, you have, and where Qualcomm and Huawei and Samsung and Intel exist. And above that, you have a layer that's composed of three pillars. One of them is devices, like your smartphones. Another layer, or another column rather, is your equipment. So basically the base stations that telecoms use, things like that, commercial equipment. And then you also have kind of like an extension of the silicon layer. So the silicon layer is kind of like an L-shaped. So it has its own pillar as well that goes into the product layer. And essentially above that you have the OS. And then above that, you have the telecoms or the service providers. That's it. And so everything that's at the top of the pyramid rests on the layer beneath it. And so without that foundational layer, you can't really have the upper portions of the pyramid. And one good way to think about it is if it's difficult to kind of grasp something that's so esoteric, is to compare it to, say, the space program. So the foundational layer is the entirety of all the math, engineering, science, physics, research, testing that goes into developing a multi-decade space program. And above that, you have the equipment manufacturers, you have everything else, and at the very top, you have companies that make really cool space helmets. And for instance, when we talk about how the ecosystem works, Apple would be at the very top of the pyramid making really cool space suits and space helmets, while Qualcomm and Huawei are at the bottom creating the foundational layer, essentially developing the entire, or the science for the space program that other companies in the layers above it are going to be able to benefit from.
So you've talked a little bit about this, the space helmet and the underlying technology, but look, with any technology, right, there are the makers, and you've talked about that, and then there are the users.
Right.
So who sits on either side of that? What are the people who are going to be using this technology, and why are they involved?
Right. So again, the foundational layer is kind of the enablement layer, right? It's the science that's going to make it possible for other companies to come into the ecosystem and develop different types of products and solutions. Once you have that, on the one hand, you have the chip makers who are going to be able to create chips and chipsets, modems, all of the stuff that actually powers and drives all the components that go into the devices. That are going to be sitting on top of that technology and actually be able to be used either commercially or by consumers. And then on top of that, with that you have, as far as chip makers are concerned, you have obviously Qualcomm, Intel, Huawei. There's a dozen solid chip makers around the world that build different types of solutions there. On the equipment side, if you're asking for what some of the equipment manufacturers are, again Huawei, again Intel, Nokia, Ericsson, There's a bunch of those. When you talk about the devices, not the equipment, all of your smartphone manufacturers are really good examples of that. So again, same familiar names: Huawei, Samsung. You start running into the same thing. And so one of the interesting things about all of this is that when you look at a difference, for instance, between a Huawei and a Samsung and a Qualcomm. But let's just focus on Huawei and Qualcomm for a second, since they're so important to the foundational layer. Qualcomm creates technology and intellectual property with the purpose of licensing it out to everybody else, right? So they're kind of like creating the ability, all the science for the space program, in our analogy, that other companies can basically license and go build whatever they want and develop any solution to any problem that they want. Companies like Huawei, on the other hand, or Samsung, that also kind of partake in this, kind of are more vertical. They're more vertically integrated. Instead of innovating for everybody else, they innovate mostly for themselves. They have the entire stack, or at least if they don't yet, they're working on having a complete walled garden of technology, where if they wanted to, at the drop, well, not at the drop of a hat, but fairly quickly, they could essentially seal themselves off from everything else and from the rest of the ecosystem and build their aspect of the foundational layer, the chipsets, the equipment, the devices, the OS, and then partner with friendly service providers that would complete the pyramid for them. Whereas in the US, we don't necessarily have that. In the US, we have a more diverse ecosystem where the Qualcomms and the Intels and everybody else kind of partners together and creates this churn of opportunity. But it's an open system of innovation that depends on strong IP protections so that all this stuff can actually work together. Whereas Huawei, for instance, essentially being sponsored by the Chinese government, is capable of walling itself off and creating technology that will benefit mostly itself, and then it can pick and choose which technology it licenses out to competitors and adversaries. So,
well, you raised a question, I think, for an economist. Unfortunately, we have one on the panel. So, David, let me ask you, how did this market structure evolve, where we've got some companies who operate on a vertical basis, others who have a more open platform? Is this the best way to develop 5G, and what are the consequences for this, for either choice of market structure?
Well, let me build on what Oliver said, because people don't get this. The fact you've got this pyramid, think about the value capture or the appropriability problem. The guys making the products, well, you sell the product, that's how you capture a return for your innovation. The folks providing the foundational layer, given that we have an open system, that requires licensing, that requires intellectual property. And this is the bit that people don't get. I mean, the whole economics literature is full of the fact that, well, you know what, we should maybe subsidize basic research or foundational research. In the courts, Qualcomm is just asking for merely a royalty payment. They're not going to Washington asking for a subsidy. But that foundational layer is critical to the United States and to the world, and we need to protect it because all the other bits of the pyramid or the stack depend on it. Now, the question is, where did this come from? Well, as Oliver hinted at, this industry could have started as a bunch of vertical stacks, in which case it would be closed, there'd be less competition. Instead, we have an open system because of 3GPP and ETSI and all of that. That whole regime depends on a licensing model. And if the courts and the legislature doesn't support the licensing model, then we collapse back to the stack, which is less competition. And this is the bit the Federal Trade Commission doesn't understand at all, so it seems, given the kind of litigation that you see that they're bringing. And this is a tragedy. We have not been able to explain to the world how this foundational layer is so critical to subsequent innovation and that it requires a licensing model if it's going to be open. If you're not going to support licensing, then you got to revert back to a closed model, and it's AT&T all over again kind of model. So that's, in fact, I think where the world will go if we don't sort this mess out. And clearly, there won't be as much downstream innovation. Clearly, it will become way more fragmented. We can probably still have interoperability, but in essence, we'll put a huge damper on the biggest, innovation machine, or one of the biggest innovation machines in the global economy today.
Yeah, that's absolutely true, and I just reminded me there's an additional comment I'd like to make about this. So, when we think about this foundational layer being so important, and it's really Qualcomm versus Huawei, which is surrogates for U.S. versus China. China is very aggressively trying to gain more leadership, let's call it that, in the 5G space for obvious reasons, and Huawei is an excellent, perfect instrument for that. And I would say that over the last few years, and I don't know if it's the case for you guys, but from my perspective, it seems that Huawei has been very aggressively trying to undermine U.S. innovation and Qualcomm specifically, because they're competing against them in this foundational layer. And for Huawei to be able to not just be on equal standing with or near equal standing with Qualcomm and be able to contribute more to the standards, control this foundational layer of research and innovation would be advantageous for them, and it would be advantageous for China as well. And so what I've seen, and I recently wrote about this, is Huawei has a really clever way of weaponizing regulatory bodies and the courts around the world to try to undermine companies like Qualcomm. Because if they can undermine them in the courts, and if they can undermine them with the regulators, they can also undermine Qualcomm's ability to generate revenue through their licensing model. And so the attack on our patent system, and unfortunately the FTC appears to have allowed itself to become an instrument of Huawei to some extent in attacking Qualcomm on a basis of more contract law than really antitrust law, is very dangerous. It's something that we need to actually start talking about and guarding against, because these efforts are becoming more obvious, I think, and they're actually being not entirely effective, but they could be. And if Huawei is able to undermine Qualcomm like this and take control over the 5G process or 5G standardization process, that's not necessarily good for the U.S. It's not good for Qualcomm, obviously, but it undermines our ability as a country to drive the future of 5G, excuse me, and 6G after it, and essentially cede that leadership to China, which I don't think anybody in this room probably wants to happen.
If I may add, just we talked about standards and Huawei, so maybe I'll just give Qualcomm's perspective on this. I used to attend the standards bodies myself back in the day, 15 years back, and then I've had like lots of teams going in there. What you see in the standards process is usually just the tip of the iceberg, in the sense that we've done our homework for years before that, sometimes even more than a decade before anything even shows up in a standards body. We have a very healthy internal debates on every single design aspect. We have to go through a very rigorous process. We go about it very systematically. And I was just mentioning this yesterday. Right outside our research building, we have a plaque. It's a saying from Klein Gilhausen. He's one of our 7 founders back in 1985. When I joined Qualcomm 20 years back, that was like the mantra that was used, and we continue to use that. He said, if it hasn't been tested, it doesn't work. And imagine you're a grad student, you just finished your probably master's or a PhD, and you join the research team, and you're full of ideas, and you're immediately brought down to earth by saying, okay, all the ideas are great, but if it hasn't been tested, it doesn't work. So we go through a very rigorous process internally before we even show up in the standards domain. So we will never have the numbers that probably Huawei has, but from my perspective, I could care less, actually. I'm not worried about that part at all. I think we do extremely well in standards, just based upon the fact that we are so confident about all the things that we have done. I think we're not worried about that part. In standards domain itself, it's numbers don't matter as much. Actually, ideas matter. It's the quality of your contributions that actually matters. I can write one paper which is like a seminal document that explains exactly how things ought to be. If you compare that against maybe 10 other documents which are somewhat more marginal in nature, so you can just compare the number of contributions in itself. So I think from that perspective, we are doing pretty well in standards per se. It's hard. It's extremely hard. It's not easy at all, but I think we can do very well in that space. So I'm not worried about that. What usually happens is that post the standards process itself, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. There's still ways of going from there onwards to building the products and bringing it eventually to commercialization. And yeah, there are issues associated with that vertical structure. As Qualcomm, we are not a vertical player. We actually are a horizontal enabler. We enable a lot of other industries. And so there is that, that point that is quite valid in the sense that these vertical industries do, they tend to be a little more, I mean, you can actually do this in a far more effective manner, especially if you control the whole process in itself. But I'm not worried about how the way things actually go in standards. I think we are doing extremely well, and we can. I'm not worried about numbers from the other side.
Well, Jeanette, let me ask you, because we've talked a little bit about Huawei, and Olivier mentioned Huawei in some respects, weaponizing agency action, this sort of thing, to undermine Qualcomm. What does it mean if the United States loses the 5G race? What is it that worries you most?
If we lose the 5G race, I think it means a lot. I think we could talk about this for a long time. I think in 5G and Huawei and all these conversations that we're having is again, it's a symptom of a larger sort of challenge, is how do we ensure U.S. and sort of like-minded country leadership and industry leadership in this space. I think both previous gentlemen talked a lot about the pyramid and having these sort of vertically integrated companies. There's a lot of countries in this world that are already in that proprietary stack. People like to throw around terms like cyberspace and others as if there's this like magical virtual wonderland where we just put in a new network and now we're 5G. I mean, they're talking about if you're telling a company, well, now you need to actually rip out equipment, right? And because they're getting locked in, some of them are already locked in. The U.S. and a few others aren't in that situation. So I think there's both the security and the innovation piece. I think 5G, again, while it's a symptom of a larger challenge that we have around increasing dependence on companies that don't believe in that sort of open ecosystem that has caused all of this technology to innovate, and are increasingly locking countries' infrastructure into their model. I think it has tremendous impacts, not just on our security, but our ability to lead innovation in the future. And again, this gets back to this isn't just a security problem. This is a larger technology policy and innovation challenge. And I think the U.S. government, as well as companies, has to quickly adapt to this new model and not try to apply sort of existing frameworks and mindsets that may be applied in the 80s and the 90s. So again, it's not just about 5G, but 5G to me is that driving force to get policymakers and others to understand this space that we're in and have honest conversations with the public and with those companies that are part of this ecosystem, and also have honest conversations in trade and security and other venues with countries like China that are to try to help them understand it is more beneficial for you long term to sort of operate. Look what it has done for the U.S. Look what it has done for other countries. It's also helping developing countries understand as they start to build out their infrastructure. Look at the long-term risk of what if you choose to buy this, it may seem to cost very little right now and give you a lot of capability, but you're headed down quite a long path that it's going to be difficult for you to get out of. So those are just some of the things that we think of as in trying to kind of explain to policymakers, whether that's in Congress or in the executive branch or at state and local levels, it's about enabling innovation. It's about making sure that we're protecting IP. It's sort of these core values that we have in our capitalist economy, but it's about adapting them to a new environment where the U.S. is just not the dominant, or at least I think we're dominant in most of this, but we have the potential to lose that dominance.
Okay, so Durga, let me ask you. We've talked a little bit about this. We've touched on this. But how actually do companies develop this 5G technology? What are the technical challenges? I think this is software is really what we're talking about. I think a lot of people think of apps and somebody sitting in their mother's basement making the new app to, I don't know, feed a fictional or fictitious fictional little character on the web or a new game or something along these lines. How is it that it is so expensive to develop these this new 5G technology, and what are the technical challenges, and how does intellectual property play into that to get this to policy basis?
Maybe I can first speak from a research perspective and then switch to the product side. From a research perspective, I mean, usually one starts with basically a whiteboard, trying to define the problem that you're trying to solve, and then go through all the challenges of what it takes to solve it. There's an initial state where we're just going through just the basic design, doing a lot of analysis and simulations, trying to see which ideas make sense and which ones don't. The ones that don't make sense, discard them, move on to the next step. At some point in time, you have to actually start testing out the technology itself. It's not just about doing something in simulations only, but going into something far more practical. That means you have hardware and software written on top of it. It's okay at that point in time not to have, you should actually come by our research lab once, because every cell phone starts first looking like a refrigerator and eventually it becomes a smartphone or something like that. But it takes, in 3 years you can go from A to B. We know how to get there. That's not the issue. But in the beginning, it's a proof of concept. A lot of work. And by the way, when we go into this research mode, it's not all smooth sailing. Half the time things don't work. There's a lot of work, and then you go back and iterate, and there's a lot of pain points that we actually go through that, but you keep learning and you keep moving on. And at some point in time when it looks like, yep, this idea makes sense, in fact, it works pretty well. We usually put these devices that look like refrigerators in a van, and we drive around and we test it out. Just a couple of months back in Mobile World Congress in Barcelona, we showed for the first time how it's possible to get 5 nines of reliability in terms of operating a manufacturing equipment. Just to give a sense of that, that means you lose 1 in a million packets, and each packet is half a millisecond. That means you have to wait for 14 hours before you even figure out that, okay, I'm now at a 10 power minus 6 reliability or so. But we actually proved that, and that was a lot of manufacturing companies were like, okay, let's start to trial this. So there's work that goes on in that domain, once you get past that proof of concept. But then the next piece of the challenge from then onwards is, after the standardization, while the standardization is going on, then we start building the products. They have to work in devices which can range from, let's take one of a smartphone device. It has to work in a power and area constrained environment. It's a device that has to work all day long and not necessarily be plugged in all the time, in a very mobile environment. And it has its own set of challenges associated with it. An example of that would be, in 5G, there is something new that's coming in the US, and it's going to gradually proliferate in the rest of the world, the usage of the higher frequency bands, what is known as the millimeter wave bands. It's been seen as a challenge for a very long time by a lot of people, but over the last 5 years or so, we've been systematically, solving one problem after the other, and here we are, just months away from a point in time that you can walk into a store and buy yourself a device that works in these high bands. A lot of work that goes into that to make sure that what looks like a larger form factor device comes down to a smartphone device. The challenges that you actually go through that, there are different kinds. There are hardware-centric challenges, there are software-centric challenges, there are a lot of packaging challenges as well when you're trying to constrain it within a certain environment. So this kind of gives you a perspective of what it takes to build together the complete product. As we go into even the elements of autonomous driving, for instance, in CES earlier this year, we showed for the first time vehicles actually moving and getting messages from roadside infrastructure around them, and being able to communicate back and forth with different kinds of infrastructure in that domain. And the fact that it will work in a reliable manner is something that, again, we are still in the proof of concept phase over there, but it's a lot of work. That's all that I can say from that perspective.
And how does intellectual property play into that? We've talked a lot
So-
about how Olivia
right.
mentioned licensing technology and
That's right. So I mentioned the fact that nothing actually works off the bat. In fact, even if things ought to be working on paper and then when you start building it, it doesn't actually always work. So as you learn through the steps, there's a lot of patterns that are generated over time. Some of these, eventually, by the way, some of these ideas will have to be standardized. So those would be, eventually they will become essential to the actual operation of the standards itself. But there's a lot of other technology which happens to be not necessarily standardized, but it is very crucial for the actual implementation and eventual product as well. So you have a combination of what are called as standards essential and eventually non-standards essential patterns. But an enormous amount of intellectual property actually comes along the way. And this can span multiple years. An example of that is we worked on peer-to-peer communication between two devices because we were actually thinking in terms of public safety. This was one of the concepts, in the mid 2000s when the idea was there is no infrastructure around you. Maybe it's a first responder situation wherein you walk into a situation, there is no infrastructure around you, and these devices ought to communicate with each other. We spent years working on that. It never got commercial traction. It just didn't, and it took a long time, and then we started pivoting, and yes, it had its applications in public safety. That went around well. But then we said, well, why does it have to be just two smartphones communicating with each other? Why can't it be two vehicles communicating with each other? Somewhere along those lines, then we started looking at vehicular communications, and here we are talking of autonomous driving and the applications of 5G in that. But enormous amount of intellectual property actually gets generated along the way, and a lot of hard work that goes behind the scenes. And so what you see in the last 18 months during the standardization phase, that's just the tip of the iceberg. There's years and years of work that actually goes in before we see that.
So we've talked a lot about 5G, the importance, the positive benefits, the future. What are the policies the United States should adopt to maximize success in 5G? And this is really a question for anybody. David.
I'll have a go at it first. I mean, first of all, we have to get coordinated policies. We can't have antitrust in a silo, national security in a silo, technology policy in a silo, and industrial policy to the extent we have it in another silo. And I think the whole 5G story brings that home. We can't even get the FTC and the DOJ to coordinate on antitrust issues. But what this requires, and I think this is precisely what Jeanette was saying, we've got to get rid of our traditional modes of thinking about problems. And it's comfortable when there's received wisdom to just go do what you did before. But most of our policies are built on the industrial period. We're now in the knowledge economy. We're now in the software economy. And if we don't coordinate, we're not going to be able to compete globally and deliver the kind of economic welfare domestically that we've traditionally done. So I think we need a major shakeup in policy formation in this country, and we need our analysts and our good people in the government to really get out of their silos and start looking at the issues as they are in the global economy and understand that these technologies have impacts across multiple sectors, and if you can't coordinate, you're going to get it wrong.
If I may, without quite answering the full question, but let me give you this perspective. If you think about just the mobile broadband set of use cases, keep in mind that the cellular industry, this is our 5th generation together, so it's been a pretty, it's an ecosystem wherein we all know each other very well, in the sense that you have the ones who bring the technology to the table, the chipset vendors, the handset vendors, the infrastructure vendors, and the mobile operators. We all know each other very well, and we've gone through several generations of that. That's a pretty well-oiled machine. I'm not worried about that part, by the way. That is going to continue doing very well. But think about what we said about 5G. 5G is a lot more than just mobile broadband. It touches upon so many of these new industries which have never embraced cellular technology before. Some of them, in fact, there is a confluence of both regulatory policy and then other aspects from the government perspective which become important. Let's say that you want to operate the electricity grid using 5G technology. Is it enough if we just build the technology, show a proof of concept, standardize it, and we say we are done? We don't think so. Actually, there's a lot more work that needs to go from that point onwards to making it into something more mainstream. I think that's a place where there is a gap. That gap doesn't exist in mobile broadband like cell phones and laptops and so on, but it does exist in this domain where both regulatory policy and spectrum allocation, there's a bunch of other things that are probably equally important over there. This is a place where some of the other countries, there is a little bit more of an involvement from the government. It's early days. I'm not, I'm saying that that's not what we are doing, but they've taken more proactive steps. An example of that is in Germany, for instance, there is dedication of a specific block of spectrum just for industrial applications, just so that there is incentives to actually go into that domain and start experimenting. The FCC has been doing an excellent job in terms of taking steps in that direction, but those are the kinds of things that I think we should be paying attention to, especially as you're looking at these new vertical industries. The same thing applies to autonomous driving as well. Department of Transportation has a role, some sort of a role over there to say these are the tests that one must go through before you can certify this process. And we'd like to help from our side, but there needs to be work from the other side as well.
Anybody else?
Yeah, I mean, to add a little bit to the comment about more coordination with the government, that would be nice. When certain companies are essentially under attack from adversaries who have different or at least opposing geostrategic interests, it would help for agencies that are suddenly in a position to undermine or attack or challenge these U.S. companies to be made aware of this situation or the context so that they can make better decisions as to how and when or how not to and when not to file charges against them or chase them around in court. Another thing is and I feel like I'm beating a dead horse with this, but we need to get to a point where from a regulatory perspective, and even when it comes to Congress, lawmakers, essentially our decision makers in government need to get to a point where they're not just technologically literate, but where we have true technological fluency. And we're barely at the point now where we're attempting to create technological literacy in government, and that's not good enough. And we need to get better about educating, having these types of conversations, having these types of events, and then having more follow-through to be able to provide the kinds of insights and tools to decision makers and lawmakers that they need and don't currently have.
I guess I would just echo sort of what we were talking about in the beginning is, that I would kind of lump just internet in general, network technologies and 5G. And I think I've been now working in cybersecurity in the government for about 12 years. And it's sort of, it's a struggle, right? And we a couple administrations ago, we sort of said, look, there's this thing called cybersecurity. We need to really be serious about cybersecurity. We need to be serious about protecting these networks. But in one sense, that was good. We prioritized it. We created organizations called Cybercom and my Office of Cybersecurity and all these things. But in many ways, we also distanced it from other conversations. And so you had the economic and the trade folks over here talking. You had the security people over here talking. And then the regulators, they're independent, so they do what they do. And so spending a lot of time trying to bring all these people back together, because it's what's the point of securing if you're trying to enable something to continue to operate? That's the point of the security. And so to sort of echo what David was saying is you've got to bring all these different perspectives together, both within the government and without, that requires some ability to understand what the internet actually is and how mobile technologies actually work. And because you've got a lot of people saying, well, 5G is here because my handset says it's 5G enabled. And so they're automatically going, well, my car could be driven off the road by an adversary. And it's really hard to have some of these conversations when you've got such disparate levels of understanding of the technology itself. But just it calls really a lot of sort of deep-held beliefs about what the role of the U.S. government is, how we project military power, how we leverage technologies, what international laws applies, the regulatory community. It sort of challenges every single aspect of traditional government policymaking and operations. So it's not, while it needs to be coordinated, but it's not easy, and I don't think people kind of appreciate the full scale of what we're kind of taking on is, 60, 70 years of sort of received wisdom, if you will, now about these technologies. But it's really, you're talking about power and communications now, that everybody else they're already dependent on power. They're increasingly dependent on access to communications, whether wireless or not. And so it's sort of having these conversations about if this is truly the platform that we're all going to evolve to, how do we have a coherent policy? Industrial policy, I know people start to envision like planned economies, and so people don't love that term, but that is really what we need to start to be talking about is, and what's the role in government in enabling that and securing and making sure it's safe.
Okay, I'm going to ask one more question to the panel, then maybe open it up for a question or two from the audience. So think of your questions if you have any. I was on a panel last week in talking about 5G, and one of the participants at the panel said, well, the auto industry, they'll be users of this new 5G technology, and they don't necessarily want to have to keep paying for this technology. They just want to write one check. And this brought to mind, Durga, you said until 5G, all up through 4G, the universe of participants was fairly well known to one another. It's a well-oiled machine. 5G is going to incorporate brand new entrants into this whole ecosystem, and what problems is that going to cause, I guess, is a question.
Actually, it's been relatively smooth so far. When we started working on 5G, we didn't first define what we wanted to do with 5G and then went around and talking to our potential customers about it. We actually started the other way around. Quite a few years back, when we first started talking to water meter companies, gas meter companies, automotive industry has been using cellular communications for basic telematics, which means that you just have the vehicle which is connected to the network. It's a gigantic smartphone. You can actually think about it that way. But just basic connectivity in itself. But as we actually went about this in the following way. First, we explained this is what we think the technology can do. Is it something of interest to you? And in fact, the other way around, what are the problems that you think you have today that can be solved? And you let us know. And it was a very healthy dialogue. It actually happened for a long period of time before we even started getting into 5G standardization. And as a part of that process, we also encouraged everyone in these new vertical industries to embrace it and be a part of that standardization process. The best way to be heard is to actually get involved, get plugged in, and be a part of it. 10 years back, if you walk into a 3GPP standards meeting, it was just the same community that I talked of earlier. Today, when you walk into a 3GPP meeting, you're going to see General Motors, you're going to see Tesla, you're going to see Ford, BMW, Daimler. This is a very different ballgame, and I'm actually really happy about that because now they get to participate and say, hey, no, these are my requirements, this is what I need. And by the way, when I want to do this with 5G, I want to make sure that I don't necessarily use, just as an example, SIM cards, because that's not the way that we operate. It's actually slightly different. I don't need a plastic card that needs to be inserted over there. It needs to be something embedded. And you can see that embedded SIMs now are actually making their way into smartphones as well. You don't necessarily need. So there's been a healthy learning on both sides from that perspective. The same concept actually came in from a lot of the metering companies as well. I think in terms of these new vertical industries embracing the technology, we were cautious and nervous about it in the beginning, but actually that is gradually dissipating, just based upon the very diverse set of players that can be seen as a part of the standardization process itself. And that once you are there with that, I think from that point onwards, there's less concern.
Well, it's a good note of optimism.
Yes.
Yeah, there's also a point that people don't necessarily have visibility to, and sometimes it's been opaque historically, is the actual price of this licensing of these portfolios. We talk about, you know, whether it's too expensive to license out technology, especially standard essential patents, whether it's not expensive enough, and there's a lot of litigation out there, or arguments in lawsuits that claim that licensing is too expensive. It's not. It's a few dollars per smartphone. It's a few dollars per vehicle. The licensing is actually shockingly cheap for access to all these licenses and patents, without which none of these devices or vehicles would be able to do what they do. And I think it's also important to start highlighting that point, that especially standard essential patent licensing is ridiculously affordable. And so it eliminates, by having this open ecosystem of innovation and licensing, you really do essentially eliminate most barriers of entry for small companies, large companies. And it's how a company like Tesla can basically be built from scratch and become a major player in the auto industry in just a few years, and how GM and Ford and other like established automotive companies can also become competitors of Tesla. And it's something that we need to talk about a little bit more. The integration into 5G, or being able to incorporate 5G into existing industries, these are all operational challenges. But on the licensing side, it's almost a non-issue. And if it weren't that way, if we switch to a model that's more vertically integrated with walled gardens, that starts to go away.
Well, thank you. It's a good table setting for the rest of the conference. So, Kirti, thank you. And thank you to all the panelists. And I hope you have a good day.
Thanks, Greg.